The dust from the cattle drive settled like a death sentence over Margaret Flynn's boots as she stood before Cornelius Whitmore, the most powerful cattle baron in all of Montana territory, and heard him laugh at her dream of owning land. It was the summer of 1884, and Margaret had spent 3 years working every job a woman could find in Butte, Montana, saving every penny, every nickel, every cent she earned from washing clothes, serving meals at the boarding house, and mending torn shirts by candlelight until her fingers bled. She had walked into Whitmore's massive ranch house that morning with her life savings wrapped in a handkerchief, $240 that represented 1,000 days of labor, hoping to purchase 40 acres of grazing land he had mentioned selling off at the edge of his property. The land was rocky and difficult, not prime cattle country, but it was land, and it could be hers. Whitmore had looked at her as if she had asked to buy the moon itself. "Miss Flynn, I appreciate your ambition, truly I do," he had said, leaning back in his leather chair, his silver watch chain glinting across his expansive belly. "But a woman owning land, running cattle, it's not natural, it's not proper. What happens when you marry? What happens when you need a man's strength to handle the difficult decisions? No, I couldn't in good conscience sell to you. Find yourself a husband, and perhaps we can discuss this matter with him." Margaret had felt something crack inside her chest, not break entirely, but fracture in a way that let rage seep through. "The money is the same color whether it comes from my hand or a man's," she had said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "The money isn't the issue, dear girl." Whitmore had stood then, moving to show her the door. "It's the principle of the thing. I have a reputation to maintain. What would people say if I sold prime Montana land to a spinster with notions above her station?" "You just said it was rocky land, hardly suitable," Margaret had countered. "Unsuitable for a woman alone, certainly." His smile had been patronizing, final. "Good day, Miss Flynn. I'm sure you'll understand in time." Now Margaret stood outside his gate, the money still clutched in her handkerchief, her throat tight with unshed tears. She was 23 years old, and she had never felt so small, so powerless, so utterly defeated. The Montana sky stretched above her in that endless blue that had once seemed full of possibility, and now felt like a ceiling pressing down on all her hopes. She started the long walk back toward Butte proper, her worn boots kicking up small clouds with each step. The town sprawled before her, a collection of wood buildings and mining operations that had exploded into existence when copper was discovered in the mountains. It was a rough place, full of miners and gamblers and women who sold more than just meals. But it had been her home for 3 years, and she had carved out a respectable existence despite the odds. The boarding house where she worked loomed ahead, a 3-story structure that always smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, was a kind woman who paid fair wages, but Margaret knew she couldn't spend the rest of her life washing sheets and serving breakfasts. She wanted earth beneath her fingernails that belonged to her. She wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away. "You look like someone just shot your dog." Margaret jerked her head up to find a cowboy leaning against the fence outside the boarding house, one boot propped on the lower rail. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His hat was pushed back on his head, and there was something in his expression that was curious without being intrusive. "I don't have a dog," Margaret said shortly, moving to pass him, figure of speech. He straightened, and she noticed he moved with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life in a saddle. "But you do look like you've had a bad day. I'm Yates Harper. I work the range for Whitmore, though I'm thinking of moving on soon." Margaret stopped despite herself. "You work for Whitmore, for now. Been with him about 8 months, but the man's got a way of rubbing folks wrong. Yates tilted his head, studying her. You the woman who went to see him about buying land this morning? Heat flushed Margaret's cheeks. News travels fast. Cook heard him telling his foreman about it, laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Said some woman with more guts than sense tried to buy property. Yates's expression had gone serious. Didn't seem funny to me. And why would you care? Margaret heard the sharpness in her own voice and couldn't quite regret it. She was tired of men and their opinions, tired of being patted on the head and dismissed. Yates was quiet for a moment, then said, My mother owned land in Texas. 30 acres she inherited from her father. She ran it herself after my pa died when I was 10. Raised me and my 2 sisters on that land, made it profitable, kept it going through droughts and hard winters. Then she remarried when I was 15, and the moment she said I do, everything she had built became her new husband's property by law. He sold it 6 months later for drinking money. Something in his voice made Margaret look at him more carefully. There was old anger there, worn smooth by time but never truly gone. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Point is, I know a thing or two about how hard it is for women to hold on to anything in this world. He glanced toward the mountains rising beyond the town. Whitmore's not the only one selling land around here. Have you checked the Territorial Land Office? The what? The Land Office. Federal government's been selling off parcels under the Homestead Act since 1862. Free land, well, nearly free. You file a claim, pay a small filing fee, live on it and improve it for 5 years and it's yours. Or you can buy it outright after 6 months of residence for about $1.25 an acre. Margaret stared at him. Free land. There are requirements and it's not easy. You have to build a dwelling, cultivate the soil, actually live there. But it's legal, and it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. The law's the law. Yates pushed away from the fence. I'm heading to the land office tomorrow to check on some parcels myself. If you want, I could show you how it works. Why would you help me? Margaret asked, suspicion and hope warring in her chest. Yates met her eyes directly. Because someone should have helped my mother. Because Whitmore laughing about you this morning made me want to quit on the spot. And because you walked into that ranch house alone with your savings and asked for what you wanted. That takes courage, Miss Flynn. How do you know my name? Cook mentioned that too. His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. Butt's not a big town and you're memorable. Margaret felt something flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with land claims. She pushed it aside. I work until noon tomorrow. I'll meet you at 1 o'clock, outside the land office on Main Street. Yates settled his hat more firmly on his head. Bring your money and any documents you have proving your identity. Letters, a Bible with your family records, anything like that. I have a certificate from the church in Illinois where I was christened, and letters from my sister. That'll do. He tipped his hat to her. Until tomorrow, then, Miss Flynn. Margaret watched him walk away, his long strides carrying him down the dusty street toward the livery stable. She looked down at the handkerchief in her hand, at the money she had worked so hard to save, and felt something she hadn't felt since Whitmore's dismissal that morning. She felt hope. The land office was a small wooden building that Margaret had passed 100 times without really seeing. She arrived at 10 minutes before 1 o'clock, her important papers tucked into her reticule, her best dress carefully brushed and pressed. It was brown cotton, practical and plain, but it was clean and respectable, and she held her head high as she climbed the 3 steps to the door. Yates was already there, sitting on a bench outside with his hat on his knee. He stood when he saw her, and Margaret noticed he had cleaned up as well. His shirt was pressed, his face freshly shaved, and there was a kind of quiet confidence in how he held himself. "Ready?" he asked. "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted. "That's honest." He opened the door for her. "But you're here anyway, and that's what matters." The interior of the land office was cramped and dusty, filled with filing cabinets and surveying maps that hung on every available wall. A man with spectacles perched on his nose sat behind a desk covered in papers, and he looked up with an expression of mild irritation at being interrupted. "Help you?" he asked. "This is Miss Margaret Flynn," Yates said before Margaret could speak. "She's interested in filing a homestead claim." The clerk's expression shifted to something between surprise and skepticism. "A homestead claim? You understand that requires you to live on the land and improve it." "I understand," Margaret said, finding her voice. "I'm prepared to do whatever is required." The clerk glanced at Yates, as if seeking confirmation from the man in the room. Yates simply looked back at him with a level stare until the clerk coughed and pulled out a large ledger. "Well then, let's see what's available." He opened the book, running his finger down columns of numbers and descriptions. "Most of the good land close to town has been claimed already. There's a parcel about 8 miles north near the creek, 160 acres, rocky soil, but there's water and some timber." "May I see it on a map?" Margaret asked. The clerk looked surprised again but pulled down one of the surveying maps. He pointed to a section marked in pencil. "There. It borders open range on 2 sides, government land on the 3rd, and a small ranch on the 4th. Margaret studied the map, her heart beating fast. 160 acres. It was more than the 40 she had hoped to buy from Whitmore. "What's the filing fee?" $14. "Then you have to build a dwelling at least 12 by 14 feet, dig a well or have a water source, and cultivate at least 10 acres within 5 years. After that, if you've met all requirements, the land is yours free and clear. And the option to purchase after 6 months. That would be $200 for 160 acres. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "But I should warn you, miss, that homesteading is difficult work. Most single women who try end up abandoning their claims." "Then I'll be the exception," Margaret said firmly. She pulled out her handkerchief of money. "I'd like to file the claim now, please." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and legal language that Margaret struggled to follow. Yates stood beside her the entire time, occasionally pointing to a line in the documents and explaining what it meant in plain English. The clerk asked for her identity documents, copied information into multiple ledgers, and finally handed her a certificate of filing that felt like pure gold in her hands. "You'll need to establish residence within 6 months," the clerk said. "After that, you'll need to file annual proofs of improvement and residence. Miss this and you'll forfeit your claim." "I understand," Margaret said. She looked down at the paper at her name written in official ink. Margaret Catherine Flynn, homesteader. Her eyes stung and she blinked rapidly. Outside in the bright afternoon sun, she finally let herself breathe. "I own land," she whispered. "Well, I will own it. In 5 years or 6 months if I can earn another $60. "You did it," Yates said, and there was warmth in his voice that made her look up at him. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying, wonderful, impossible," she laughed, a slightly wild sound. "I need to see it, the land. I need to see what's mine. I can take you tomorrow if you'd like. I know the area. It's rough country, but it's beautiful in its own way." Margaret hesitated. It was one thing to accept help at the land office, another to spend a day alone with a man she barely knew riding out into the wilderness. But something in Yates's eyes was steady and trustworthy, and she had already taken so many risks today. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "I can be ready by dawn. I'll bring 2 horses and supplies for the day." He paused, then added, "Miss Flynn, what you did today took real courage. Don't let anyone tell you different." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but this time it had nothing to do with embarrassment. "Thank you, Mr. Harper, for everything." "Yates," he said. "If we're going to be neighbors, you should call me Yates." "Neighbors? That small ranch that borders your property? I filed my own claim last week. 80 acres right next to yours." His smile was genuine now, transforming his serious face. "Figured it was time to stop working for men like Whitmore and start building something of my own." Margaret looked at him, this cowboy who had appeared in her life at exactly the right moment, who had helped her without asking for anything in return, who was smiling at her like she had done something remarkable instead of something foolish. "Then you should call me Margaret," she said softly. The ride out to the land took 3 hours, following a rough trail that climbed into the foothills of the mountains surrounding Butte. Yates had brought a gentle mare for Margaret, and he rode beside her on a rangy gelding that had clearly been with him for years. The morning was cool and clear, and as they climbed higher, Margaret could see the sprawl of Butte below them, smoke from the mines drifting up like morning fog. "Tell me about Illinois," Yates said as they rode. "What brought you all the way to Montana?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, organizing thoughts she rarely shared. "My parents died of typhoid when I was 19. There were 4 of us children, and we were split up among relatives. My older sister took the 2 younger ones, but her husband didn't want me. Said I was too old to be dependent, but too young to be useful." The old hurt was still there, but dulled by time and distance. "I had a little money from selling our parents' things. Enough for a train ticket west and a few months of room and board. I chose Montana because I read that there were opportunities here, that the territory was growing." "Do you ever regret it, leaving your family?" "Every day," Margaret admitted, "but I also know I would have regretted staying. My sister's husband wanted me to marry his brother, a man 30 years older who had already buried 2 wives. I couldn't face that future." She glanced at Yates. "What about you? How did you end up in Montana? After my mother lost her land, things got bad at home. Her new husband was a mean drunk, and when I was 17, we had words that ended with fists. I left that night and never went back." His jaw tightened. "I heard later that my mother died 2 years after I left. My sisters wrote to me, said she just gave up, stopped fighting. I wasn't there for her." "You were barely more than a boy," Margaret said gently. "You did what you had to do to survive." "Maybe. But I've spent the last 8 years working other men's cattle, sleeping in bunkhouses, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I'm 25 now, and I figure it's past time I put down roots." He gestured ahead, where the trail opened into a broad valley. "And here's where we'll both do it." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The land spread before her was nothing like the rich farmland of Illinois, but it had a wild beauty that spoke to something deep in her chest. Rocky soil, yes, but covered in tough prairie grass that rippled in the wind like water. A creek cut through the eastern side, lined with cottonwood trees and willows. The mountains rose behind it all, still capped with snow even in summer, and the sky seemed impossibly vast. "This is mine," she whispered. 160 acres of it." Yates pointed. "The creek is the eastern boundary. See that line of rocks there? That's roughly the southern edge. It runs north up to those pines and west to that outcropping." Margaret urged her horse forward, moving into the center of what would be her property. She could see where the land would be difficult to work, where rocks jutted up through the soil and the grass grew sparse. But she could also see flat areas where crops might grow, where a house could stand with a view of the mountains, where cattle could graze. "There's a natural spring about a quarter-mile up," Yates said, riding up beside her. "Good, clean water year-round, and see those trees. That's timber for building." "It's perfect," Margaret said, and didn't care that her voice cracked. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Yates showed her the boundaries, helped her understand the lay of the land, pointed out where previous homesteaders had tried and failed to make a go of it. There was an old foundation near the creek, stones stacked 2 feet high before being abandoned. What happened to them? Margaret asked, looking at the remnants of someone else's dream. Left after the first winter, according to the land office records. It's hard out here, Margaret. I won't lie to you about that. The winters are brutal, the summers can be dry, and you'll be miles from town. He dismounted and helped her down from her horse. But if anyone can make it work, I think you can. They were standing very close, and Margaret found herself looking up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He had a scar above his left eyebrow and smile lines at the corners of his eyes. His hands, steadying her arms, were calloused and strong. There was something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "Really?" Yates was silent for a long moment. "The first time I saw you was about 2 months ago. You were carrying a basket of laundry down Main Street, and you stopped to help a little girl who had dropped her doll in a mud puddle. You didn't hesitate, even though it meant getting mud on your dress. You washed that doll off at the public pump and handed it back like it was a precious treasure." He smiled, a bit self-conscious. "I asked Mrs. Henderson about you the next time I was in town. She said you were the hardest working woman she'd ever met, that you never complained and always had a kind word for everyone. I've been trying to work up the courage to speak to you ever since." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she had kept firmly locked for years. "You helped me because you wanted to know me. I helped you because you deserved help. But yes, I wanted to know you." He stepped back, giving her space. "I'm not expecting anything, Margaret. I just want you to know that you have a neighbor who'll be there if you need anything." Margaret looked around at the land that would be hers, at the mountains and the sky and the endless possibility of it all. Then she looked back at Yates, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known to speak. "I'm going to need a lot of help," she said. "I don't know the first thing about building a house or digging a well or any of it." "Then it's lucky I know quite a bit about all of those things." Yates's smile was back, warm and genuine. "And I have Sundays off from Whitmore's ranch, at least until I quit, which I'm planning to do at the end of the month." They made plans on the ride back to town. Margaret would give her notice at the boarding house, but asked to stay on for 1 more month, working and saving every penny she could. Yates would start gathering materials for building, would talk to men he trusted about helping with the heavy work. They would aim to have a cabin built before the first snow, something small but solid that would meet the requirements of the homestead claim. "You'll need furniture, supplies, everything," Yates said as Butt came into view below them. "And livestock. Even a few chickens and a milk cow will make a big difference." "I have $40 left after the filing fee," Margaret said, "and I can save maybe 20 more this month. I've got about 100 saved up. We can pool our resources, help each other get started." He glanced at her. "I know that's not entirely proper, but these are unusual circumstances." "Proper went out the window when I decided to homestead alone," Margaret said dryly. "I'll take any help I can get." But as they rode back into town, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what she was starting. Not just the homestead, but this connection with Yates Harper. She had sworn off men after seeing what marriage did to women's independence, after watching her sister lose herself in her husband's demands. But Yates didn't feel like a threat to her freedom. He felt like a partner, like someone who understood what she was fighting for because he was fighting for the same thing. It was dangerous to feel this way. Dangerous to hope for more than just land. But as Yates helped her down from her horse in front of the boarding house, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment longer than necessary, Margaret allowed herself to feel it anyway. The next month was a blur of activity. Margaret worked her regular hours at the boarding house, then spent every spare moment planning and preparing. Mrs. Henderson, when she heard about the homestead claim, had been surprisingly supportive. "About time you aimed for something bigger," the older woman had said. "You're too smart and too determined to spend your life making beds for minors. I'll be sorry to lose you, but I'm proud of you, girl." Yates came to town every Sunday, and they would spend the day shopping for supplies, making lists, and discussing plans. Margaret learned that he had a head for practical matters and a patient way of explaining things. He taught her how to judge the quality of lumber, how to bargain with merchants who thought women were easy marks, how to plan a garden that would actually grow in Montana's short summer season. And somewhere in those Sundays, between discussions of nails and seed potatoes, Margaret fell a little bit in love. It happened in small moments. The way Yates listened to her ideas without dismissing them. The way he laughed at her jokes, genuine and unguarded. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was something precious and surprising. They were at the general store, looking at cast iron cookware, when Cornelius Whitmore walked in. The cattle baron stopped short when he saw them, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker. "Harper, Miss Flynn." His gaze moved between them, calculating. "I see you found yourself a protector, Miss Flynn. Very clever." Margaret felt her spine stiffen. "I found myself a friend, Mr. Whitmore, and a neighbor." "Is that what we're calling it?" Whitmore stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the narrow aisle. "I heard you filed a homestead claim on that rocky waste land up near Red Creek. Do you really think you can make a go of it?" "I intend to try. And you, Harper, I suppose you're abandoning your position on my ranch to play at being a landowner." There was contempt in Whitmore's voice. "I gave you my notice 2 weeks ago," Yates said evenly. "I've fulfilled my obligations. You've fulfilled nothing. You're throwing away a good position to chase a fool's dream with a woman who has no business trying to run land." Whitmore's voice rose. "Mark my words, you'll both be back in town begging for work before the first snow falls. That land has broken better people than you." "Then I guess we'll find out," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore." She took Yates's arm and walked out of the store, her head high, her heart hammering. Behind them, she heard Whitmore's derisive snort. Outside, in the summer sunshine, Yates let out a long breath. "That man has a gift for making people want to prove him wrong. Then that's what we'll do." Margaret looked up at him. "We'll build something so successful he'll choke on his contempt." Yates laughed, a real laugh that made his eyes crinkle. "Deal, partners in proving Whitmore wrong." He held out his hand and Margaret shook it, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth. "Partners," she agreed. The first Sunday of August, they moved their basic supplies out to the land. Yates had quit Whitmore's ranch and was now living in a tent on his own property, working from sunup to sundown to clear land and start his own cabin. Margaret was still in town, but she came out every moment she could spare, bringing food and supplies, helping however she could. They started with Margaret's cabin, reasoning that she needed to establish residence first. Yates had recruited 2 other cowboys he trusted, men who were willing to work for fair wages and some of Margaret's cooking. Together, the 4 of them set about building a home. Margaret learned how to notch logs, how to think mud for chinking between the timbers, how to split shingles for a roof. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her back ached every night, and she had never been happier. "You're a natural at this," Yates said one evening as they took a break, sitting on what would eventually be her front porch. The walls were up and the roof was half done. In another week it would be habitable. "I like working with my hands. I like seeing progress." Margaret wiped sweat from her forehead. "In the boarding house, You work all day and the next day everything needs to be done again. This is different. This lasts. This lasts, Yates echoed. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that made her stomach flutter. Margaret, I need to tell you something. Her heart sped up. What is it? I didn't just help you because of my mother, or because I admired your courage, though both those things are true. He turned to face her fully. I helped you because from the moment I first saw you, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And these past weeks, working beside you, getting to know you, it's only gotten worse. Or better. I'm not sure which. Margaret's breath caught. Yates, I know you want your independence. I know you came out here to build something that's yours alone. And I respect that, I swear I do. But I need you to know how I feel. Even if you don't feel the same way, even if you never want anything more than friendship, I needed to say it. He reached out, gently touching her cheek. You're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. And I think I'm falling in love with you. The world seemed to still. Margaret looked into his eyes, those creek water green eyes, and saw nothing but honesty and hope, and a vulnerability that made her heart ache. I'm scared, she whispered. I've seen what marriage does to women, how it takes everything they are and makes it someone else's property. I'm not asking you to marry me. Not now, maybe not ever if that's not what you want. Yates's thumb brushed her cheekbone. I'm just asking if maybe you feel something too. If maybe this partnership could be more than just about land. Margaret thought about the last month, about the way her days had started revolving around when she would see Yates next, about how his smile had become the best part of her week, about how, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, she had imagined what it might be like to have him beside her, not as a master or owner, but as a true partner. I'm falling in love with you too, she said, and felt something loosen in her chest. And it terrifies me. Yates let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. It terrifies me too, but I think it's the best kind of terrified. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when Margaret didn't, he kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and tasted like possibility. Margaret's hands came up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself, and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and hope and fear that had been building inside her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this right, he said. I want to court you properly, even if we're doing it backward by building homesteads together first. I want everyone to know that you're choosing me, not settling for me, not needing me, but choosing me. I want that too, Margaret said, and I want you to know that my land stays mine. If we ever marry, I want it in writing that what I've built remains in my name. Absolutely. Yates pulled back to look at her seriously. I'll sign anything you want. Your land, your property, your independence. Those aren't things I want to take from you. They're part of who you are, and I love who you are. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. No man has ever said anything like that to me before. Then you've been talking to the wrong men. He kissed her again, briefer this time. Come on, we've got about an hour of good light left. Let's get more of that roof finished so you can move into your house before summer ends. They worked until dark, and when the other men left, Yates walked Margaret back to where she had tethered her horse. You're getting good at riding, he observed. I'm getting good at a lot of things I never thought I'd do, she smiled up at him. Thank you, Yates, for all of it. Thank you for giving me a chance. He helped her into the saddle. I'll see you tomorrow, Margaret confirmed. She rode back to town under a sky full of stars, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her heart full of a joy she had never quite imagined. She had come to Montana looking for land, for independence, for a life that was hers alone, and she had found all of that. But she had also found something else, something she hadn't been looking for but was grateful to have discovered. She had found a man who wanted to build beside her, not above her. Margaret moved into her cabin on the 15th of August, exactly 2 months after filing her claim. It was small, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it had a real floor, a stone fireplace, glass windows, and a door that shut tight. Her furniture was sparse. A bed frame that Yates had built, a table and 2 chairs she had purchased in town, a rocking chair that Mrs. Henderson had given her as a parting gift. But it was hers. That first night, lying in her own home on her own land, Margaret cried, not from sadness but from overwhelming emotion. She had done it. Despite Whitmore's dismissal, despite every voice that had told her it was impossible, despite her own fears, she had done it. The work didn't slow down with the cabin finished. Now came the hard part, making the land productive. Margaret planted a late-season garden, putting in vegetables that might mature before the first frost. She hauled rocks to build borders, carried water from the creek until Yates helped her dig a well closer to the house. She learned to use an axe, a saw, a hammer. She learned to read the sky for weather, to understand the land's moods. And through it all, Yates was there. Not hovering, not controlling, but beside her. He worked his own land during the week and came to help her every Sunday and most evenings. They fell into an easy rhythm, talking as they worked, sharing meals, stealing kisses when the moment felt right. "I want to get some cattle before winter," Margaret said one evening in late September. They were sitting outside her cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "Not many, maybe 3 or 4 cows, enough to start building a herd." "That's good thinking. Old Pete Morrison is selling off some of his stock. He's getting too old to manage a large herd. I bet he'd give you a fair price." Yates was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced ease. "What are you making?" Margaret asked, watching the shape emerge, a surprise. He grinned at her. "You'll see when it's finished." She had learned not to push when he got that expression. Instead, she leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I need to file my first proof of residence next month. It feels impossible that it's been almost 4 months since I filed the claim." "You've done more in 4 months than most people do in years." Yates set down his whittling and put his arm around her. "You should be proud of yourself." "I am. But I also know the hardest part is coming. Winter in Montana is no joke. We'll get through it together." He kissed the top of her head. "I've been thinking about something and I want to run it by you." "What's that?" "My cabin's about half finished. I could have it done before the first snow, but it would be tight. And we'd be spending all winter going back and forth between our properties, burning fuel and time." He paused. "What if I finished my cabin in the spring instead? What if I spent the winter here with you?" Margaret's heart kicked into a higher gear. "Yates, that would be scandalous. People would talk. People are already talking. We're out here alone together all the time. And honestly, I don't care what people say." He shifted to look at her directly. "But I care what you say. I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'd sleep in the loft, you'd have the bed, but we'd be warmer together, safer together. And I want to be here to help you through your first winter." Margaret thought about the long, cold months ahead. About storms and isolation and the very real danger of facing it all alone. But more than that, she thought about what her life had become with Yates in it. How much brighter, how much fuller. "Yes," she said, I'd like that very much." His smile was radiant. "Yeah? Yeah. But Yates, if we're going to do this, if we're going to live together through the winter, I need to know what you want from this. From us." "I want everything," he said honestly. "I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life with you, a real partnership where we're both equals. And eventually, when you're ready, I want to marry you. But only when you're ready, only when you feel secure enough in your own life that joining it with mine feels like a choice, not a necessity." "I want that too," Margaret said softly. "All of it. I'm just not ready yet." Then we wait. I'm not going anywhere. He cupped her face in his hands. You're worth waiting for, Margaret Flynn. They spent the next few weeks preparing for winter. Yates moved his essential belongings into Margaret's cabin, setting up a sleeping space in the loft that was separate but close. They cut wood until Margaret's arms ached, stacking it against the north wall of the cabin where it would stay dry. They hunted and preserved meat, stored vegetables in the root cellar they had dug together. They chinked every gap in the cabin walls, banked earth around the foundation for extra insulation, and through it all, they grew closer. Not just in love, which Margaret felt deepening every day, but in true partnership. They learned each other's rhythms, their strengths and weaknesses. Yates was patient and methodical. Margaret was quick and inventive. He was stronger. She was more flexible. He knew animals. She knew plants. They complemented each other in ways that felt almost magical. The first snow came in mid-October, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning. Yates was working on banking the barn they had built for the 4 cows Margaret had bought from Pete Morrison. Margaret was inside, canning the last of the garden produce, when she heard a horse approaching. She looked out the window and felt her stomach sink. Cornelius Whitmore sat astride a massive black horse, and he wasn't alone. 2 of his ranch hands flanked him. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, her chin high. "Mr. Whitmore, this is private property." "So it is." Whitmore dismounted, his eyes scanning the cabin, the barn, the evidence of industry everywhere. "I have to admit, Miss Flynn, you've surprised me. I didn't think you'd last a month out here. Clearly, you underestimated me. Clearly." His gaze shifted to where Yates was striding over from the barn. "Ah, Harper, I should have known you'd be here. What do you want, Whitmore?" Yates came to stand beside Margaret, not in front of her, but beside her. She appreciated that more than she could say. "I'm here to make an offer, a generous one." Whitmore pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'll buy your claim, Miss Flynn, $250. That's more than you paid, and it saves you the trouble of trying to survive a Montana winter out here." "I'm not selling. Don't be foolish. You've proven your point. You've shown everyone that a woman can file a claim and work land, but actually surviving out here long term, that's a different matter." His voice took on a patronizing tone. "Take the money, go back to town, find easier work." "I said I'm not selling." Margaret felt anger building in her chest. "This land is mine and I'm not giving it up. Everything has a price, Miss Flynn." Whitmore stepped closer, intimidating with his size. "I'm willing to go as high as 300. That's my final offer. And my final answer is no." Margaret stood her ground. "You need to leave, now." Whitmore's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. Winter out here will break you. And when it does, don't come crying to me for help." "I won't need to." Margaret gestured to the cabin, the barn, the neatly stacked woodpile. "I'm prepared, and I have help." Whitmore's gaze moved between Margaret and Yates, and something ugly crossed his face. "I see, so that's how it is. You've got yourself a kept man, Miss Flynn, very resourceful." Yates moved then, his body tensing with anger, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly, then louder to Whitmore. "Get off my land. If you come back here again uninvited, I'll file a complaint with the territorial marshal." For a moment, she thought Whitmore might push further, but something in her expression must have convinced him she meant every word. He remounted his horse with a grunt. "You're both fools," he said. "This land will break you one way or another, and when it does, I'll be waiting to pick up the pieces for pennies." He rode off, his men following, leaving Margaret and Yates standing in the yard. "Are you all right?" Yates asked, his hand coming to the small of her back. "I'm fine." Angry, but fine. Margaret watched Whitmore disappear over the rise. "Why does he care so much about my 40 acres? It's not about the land. It's about being right." Yates guided her back toward the cabin. Men like Whitmore can't stand being proven wrong. Every day you succeed out here is a personal insult to his worldview. Good, Margaret said fiercely. I hope it keeps him up at night. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Yates pulled out the piece of wood he had been whittling. It's finished, he said, holding it out to her. Margaret took it carefully. It was a small carving of a bird in flight, wings spread, beautifully detailed. It's a lark, she said softly. I remembered you told me once that your mother used to call you her little lark because you were always singing while you worked. Yates looked almost shy. I thought you might like to have something to remember her by. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. She had left Illinois with so little, had lost so much. This small carving, made by hand with care and love, meant more than all the gold in Montana. I love it, she whispered. Thank you. She set it carefully on the mantel, this first decoration in her home, and then turned back to Yates. He was watching her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. Come here, she said, holding out her hand. He came to her and she kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it. Gratitude and love and desire and hope. Yates pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her, and kissed her back with matching intensity. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I'm glad you're here, she said. I'm glad I don't have to do this alone. You never have to do anything alone again, Yates promised. Not unless you want to. The first real snow came in early November, a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left drifts up to the windows. Margaret and Yates stayed inside, keeping the fire burning, reading aloud to each other from the few books they had, playing cards, talking for hours about everything and nothing. It was during that storm, trapped inside with nowhere to go and nothing to do but be together, that Margaret realized she didn't just love Yates. She loved the life they were building. She loved waking up to find him already stoking the fire. She loved the way he made coffee exactly how she liked it. She loved his laugh, his patience, his unwavering support. And she realized something else. Being with him didn't make her less independent. It made her more complete. Yates, she said on the 3rd day of the storm as they sat together wrapped in quilts near the fire. Ask me again. He looked at her confused. Ask you what? Ask me to marry you. His eyes widened. Margaret, I said I'd wait until you were ready. There's no rush. I'm ready. She turned to face him fully. I love you, I love our life, and I want to make it official. But, she held up a hand, I want it done right. I want legal documents that protect my property rights. I want our marriage to be a true partnership, not a transfer of ownership. Yates set aside his quilt and took both her hands in his. Margaret Flynn, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you every single day that I love you, respect you, and support your dreams? Yes, Margaret said, smiling through sudden tears. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, long and deep and full of promise. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside the small cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret and Yates built their own warmth. The storm broke the next day, revealing a world transformed by snow. They dug themselves out, checked on the cattle who had weathered it well in their barn, and made plans for a wedding. We'll have to wait until spring, Margaret said practically. I'm not trying to get to town in winter weather just for a ceremony. Spring is perfect. Yates was already planning. We can have it here on your land. Invite everyone who supported us. Our land, Margaret corrected. Once we're married, we're full partners. Your 80 acres and my 160. We'll work it all together. Our land, Yates agreed, and kissed her again just because he could. They spent the winter working on legal documents, writing and rewriting until Margaret was satisfied that her rights were protected. Yates signed everything without hesitation, declaring before witnesses that he entered the marriage with full respect for his wife's property and autonomy. Word of their engagement spread through Butt, and reactions were mixed. Mrs. Henderson was delighted, sending congratulations and a beautiful quilt as an early wedding gift. Pete Morrison, the old rancher, sent his blessing and a young bull to help start their herd. But there were others, led by Cornelius Whitmore, who declared that Margaret had only succeeded because she had a man helping her, that her homestead claim was practically fraud since Yates was doing the real work. "Let them talk," Margaret said when Yates brought her the latest gossip from town. "We know the truth. The truth is that you're the hardest working person I've ever met," Yates said, "and anyone who can't see that is a fool." Winter slowly gave way to early spring. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Margaret filed her second proof of residence, documenting all the improvements to the property. The land office clerk, the same skeptical man from before, had to admit she had exceeded all requirements. "Most unusual," he muttered, stamping her documents, "but legal." "Everything's in order, Miss Flynn." "Soon to be Mrs. Harper," Margaret said proudly. They planned the wedding for the 1st of May, when the wildflowers would be blooming on their land. Yates finished his own cabin that spring, but only so they would have extra space for storing supplies and housing seasonal help. They both knew he would continue living in Margaret's cabin, which had become truly theirs. The morning of the wedding, Margaret woke to find Yates already gone, following the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride before the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson had come out the night before to stay with Margaret and help her prepare. "You look beautiful," the older woman said as she helped Margaret into a simple dress of pale blue cotton. It wasn't fancy, but it was new, and Margaret had embroidered white flowers around the collar herself. "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted, "of marrying Yates. No, of how happy I am." "It feels too good to be real," Mrs. Henderson smiled. "That's how you know it's the right thing, dear, when it feels so right that it scares you." The ceremony was held outside, near the creek where cottonwoods provided shade. A traveling preacher who made his rounds through the territory had agreed to officiate. About 30 people came, more than Margaret had expected. Miners she had served breakfast to at the boarding house. Ranch hands who had worked alongside Yates. Shopkeepers from Butt who had respected Margaret's determination. Pete Morrison stood with Yates as his best man. Mrs. Henderson stood with Margaret, and when Margaret walked out to meet Yates by the creek, the look on his face made her heart soar. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said as she reached him. "You're not supposed to say that yet," she whispered. "We haven't started. Don't care. Had to say it." He grinned at her and she laughed, and the preacher cleared his throat to begin. The ceremony was simple but profound. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising partnership and respect, love and support. When Yates slipped a simple gold band on Margaret's finger, she felt something settle deep in her soul. This was right. This was real. This was home. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." Yates kissed her to cheers and applause from their gathered friends. Margaret kissed him back, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Tears of joy, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion. They spent the rest of the day celebrating. Mrs. Henderson had brought food from town, and others had contributed what they could. There was music from a fiddle player, and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Margaret stood with Yates's arm around her waist and looked at everything they had built. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked softly. I'm thinking that a year ago I was washing sheets at a boarding house dreaming of something more. And now look at us. We own land, we have a home, we're married. It feels like a miracle. You made it happen. You had the courage to try. We made it happen, Margaret corrected. Together. That night, alone in their cabin for the first time as husband and wife, Margaret felt nervous in a way she hadn't expected. But Yates was gentle and patient, and when he made love to her for the first time, it felt like a continuation of everything they had been building together. A partnership adjoining, a promise kept afterward, lying in his arms, Margaret said, "I want to tell you something. Anything. I was so scared of losing myself in marriage, of becoming just someone's wife, losing my identity, my dreams. But being married to you doesn't feel like losing anything. It feels like gaining everything." Yates kissed her forehead. "You could never lose yourself, Margaret. You're too strong, too determined, too remarkable. All I want to do is stand beside you and watch you shine." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Margaret dreamed of the future. Of children running through fields of wildflowers, of a herd of cattle bearing their brand, of years and years of building something beautiful together. The following years proved both harder and more wonderful than Margaret could have imagined. The land demanded constant work, constant attention. There were droughts that had them hauling water from the creek to keep their garden alive. There were hard winters that tested their endurance and their supplies. There were cattle that got sick, crops that failed, equipment that broke at the worst possible times. But there were also victories. Their herd grew, slowly but steadily. They added to the cabin, building a second room and a real kitchen. They helped other homesteaders get started, sharing what they had learned. And through it all, their love deepened and matured. In the spring of 1887, 3 years after Margaret had first filed her claim, she stood before the land office clerk with all her required documentation. She had lived on the land continuously, made improvements every year, cultivated crops, and established a home. The clerk reviewed everything with painstaking care, then finally stamped the final document. "Congratulations, Mrs. Harper. The land is officially yours." Margaret walked out of that office with the deed in her hand, the legal proof that she owned 160 acres of Montana territory. She found Yates waiting outside, and she held up the paper with tears streaming down her face. "It's mine," she said. "Really, truly mine." "It always was," Yates said, pulling her into his arms. "From the moment you had the courage to file that first claim." That night, they celebrated with a special dinner and a bottle of wine they had been saving for the occasion. And that night, Margaret told Yates the other news she had been waiting to share. "I'm pregnant," she said, watching his face carefully. Yates froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. "You're... really? I saw the doctor in town last week to confirm. He thinks the baby will come in November." Yates set down his glass and crossed to her, kneeling in front of her chair. He placed his hands on her still flat stomach with a reverence that made Margaret's eyes sting. "We're going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "A family. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy, Margaret, I'm beyond happy. He looked up at her and his eyes were wet. "I'm grateful. For you, for this life, for everything. Thank you. Thank me." "I didn't do it alone," she laughed, a slightly watery sound. "Though I am a bit scared. What if I'm not a good mother? You'll be an amazing mother. Look at everything you've accomplished. Look at how you care for our home, our animals, our land. Look at how you love." He kissed her stomach gently. "This baby is already lucky." Their son was born on a cold November night, after 12 hours of labor that left Margaret exhausted but elated. Yates had ridden through a snowstorm to fetch the midwife from town, and had stayed by Margaret's side through it all, holding her hand, encouraging her, crying with her. They named him Daniel Thomas Harper, after both their fathers, and he was perfect. Dark hair like Yates, blue eyes like Margaret, and lungs that could wake the dead when he wanted to be fed. "He's so small," Yates said, holding his son for the first time with the awkward care of a new father. "How is something so small so perfect?" "He's going to grow up on this land," Margaret said, watching them with profound love. "He'll know what it means to build something with your own hands. He'll know that women can own land and men can be gentle and partnership is better than dominion. He'll know he's loved," Yates added. "More than anything, he'll know that." The years continued to unfold. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy. 2 years after his birth, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose. Then, 2 years after that, another son they called William James. Their cabin expanded again and again to hold their growing family. The ranch prospered. Their herd grew to over 100 head of cattle. They hired seasonal help during busy times, young cowboys who reminded Margaret of Yates when she first met him. They paid fair wages and treated their workers with respect, and word spread that the Harper Ranch was a good place to work. In 1892, 8 years after Margaret had first stood in Cornelius Whitmore's office and been told she could never own land, Whitmore himself showed up at their ranch again. But this time, he wasn't there to intimidate or make lowball offers. "Mrs. Harper, Mr. Harper," he said, removing his hat. He looked older, grayer, diminished somehow. "I came to apologize." Margaret, who had been working in her garden while the children played nearby, stood slowly. "Apologize. I was wrong about you, about what you could accomplish." Whitmore's voice was gruff but sincere. "You've built something remarkable here, against all odds, against my predictions, against conventional wisdom. You've built a successful ranch and a beautiful family. And I was wrong to dismiss you so completely." Margaret exchanged a glance with Yates, who had come to stand beside her. "Why are you telling us this now?" she asked. "Because I'm getting old and I'm trying to make peace with my mistakes." Whitmore looked at the cabin, the barn, the corrals, the children. "My own children have no interest in ranching. They'll sell everything when I'm gone, and the Whitmore name will fade from this territory. But you too, you've built something that will last. That's what I should have been building all along, not just land and cattle, but a real legacy." "Thank you for saying that," Margaret said quietly. "It means more than you might think." Whitmore nodded, replaced his hat, and rode away. They never saw him again. He died 2 years later, and his children did exactly as he predicted, selling off his vast holdings to a syndicate from back east. But the Harper Ranch endured. By 1895, Margaret was 34 years old and Yates was 36. They had been married for 10 years and had built a ranch that was known throughout Montana for its quality cattle and ethical practices. Their children were growing. Daniel was 7, Sarah was 5, and William was 3. They had also become advocates for other women trying to homestead. Margaret made regular trips to the land office to help women file claims, showing them what she had learned, giving them courage when they faced dismissal and doubt. She became known as someone who would help, and her cabin was always open to women who needed advice or support. "You've helped more than 30 women file claims," Yates said one evening as they reviewed their accounts. "Do you know how remarkable that is?" "I remember how alone I felt," Margaret said. "If I can make it easier for even one other woman, it's worth it." "You make everything better," Yates said, pulling her into his lap. "Do you know that? Everything you touch, everyone you meet, it all becomes better." Margaret laughed and kissed him. "Flatterer, truth-teller." He kissed her back deeper. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not since this morning." "Unacceptable." "I love you, Margaret Harper. I love you more every single day." Their children grew and thrived. Daniel showed an early aptitude for working with animals, spending hours helping Yates with the cattle. Sarah was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. William was quieter, more contemplative, but with a stubborn determination that reminded Margaret of herself. In the summer of 1898, Margaret stood in her garden, now a full acre of vegetables and flowers, and looked around at everything they had built. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a front porch where they spent summer evenings. The barn was twice the size it had started, housing not just cattle but horses, chickens, and 2 milk cows. Their land, once rocky and rough, had been tamed and cultivated into productive pastures. But more than the physical structures, Margaret was proud of what they had built together. A partnership that had stood the test of time, weathering hardships and celebrating victories. 3 children who were growing up knowing that hard work and integrity mattered more than money or status. A community of friends and neighbors who supported each other. "Mama, look." Sarah came running up, her dress dusty, her braids coming loose. "I found a bird's nest in the cottonwood, did you?" Margaret smiled down at her daughter. "What kind of bird?" "I think it's a lark. There are 4 eggs, a lark." Margaret thought of the carving that still sat on their mantel, Yates's first gift to her. She thought of her mother calling her a little lark all those years ago in Illinois. She thought of how far she had come, how much she had survived and accomplished. "That's lucky," she told Sarah. "Larks are special birds. They represent joy and hope." "Like us?" Sarah asked with the innocent wisdom of children. "Exactly like us." Margaret scooped her daughter into her arms, carrying her toward the house where Yates was teaching Daniel how to repair a bridle and William was napping in his room. "Exactly like us." That evening, after the children were in bed, Margaret and Yates sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. They did this most nights, treasuring these quiet moments together. "You ever think about that first day?" Margaret asked. "When you found me outside the boarding house looking like someone had shot my dog," Yates laughed. "Every day. That was the day my life really started. Mine too." She leaned against him. "I was so angry at Whitmore, so defeated, I thought my dreams were over. Instead, they were just beginning. Because you helped me, because you showed me there was another way." Margaret took his hand, linking their fingers together. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Yes, you could have. Maybe it would have been harder, maybe it would have taken longer, but you would have done it. You had that strength in you all along." Yates kissed her temple. "I just had the privilege of walking beside you while you did it." "We walked together," Margaret insisted. "That's what made it work." "We walked together." The years continued to pass in that easy rhythm of ranch life. Seasons turned, children grew, the land yielded its bounty. In 1902, when Daniel was 14, he asked if he could start his own small herd, buying calves with money he had saved from doing extra work around the ranch. Margaret and Yates agreed, and watched with pride as their son began building his own legacy. Sarah, at 12, declared she wanted to be a teacher. She had been helping some of the younger children in the area learn to read, and she had discovered a passion for education. Margaret and Yates supported her dream completely, already planning for her to attend the new normal school that had opened in Bozeman. William, at 10, was content to work the land. He loved growing things, experimenting with different crops, figuring out what would thrive in Montana's challenging climate. He had turned a corner of their property into his own experimental garden and already showed signs of becoming an innovative farmer. "They're all so different," Margaret marveled one day, "but they're all so perfectly themselves." "They learned from watching you," Yates said. They learned that you can be whoever you want to be if you're willing to work for it. In 1905, 21 years after Margaret had first filed her homestead claim, the Montana Territory became a state. Margaret and Yates celebrated with their neighbors, proud to be part of the new state's founding generation. And that same year, Sarah left for normal school, becoming the first in their family to seek higher education. "Don't cry," Yates said as they watched the stage carry Sarah toward Bozeman. "She'll be back for holidays." "I know. I'm not crying because I'm sad. I'm crying because I'm proud." Margaret wiped her eyes. "She's going to do amazing things." "Just like her mother," Yates said, and pulled her close. Daniel married at 20, choosing a young woman named Emily who had homesteaded with her family a few miles away. The wedding was held at the Harper Ranch, and Margaret couldn't help but think of her own wedding nearly 20 years before. So much had changed, yet so much remained the same. "You're getting older," Yates teased her that night as they got ready for bed. Margaret was 44 now, her dark hair showing strands of silver, her hands marked by years of hard work. "So are you," she countered. He was 46, with gray at his temples and laugh lines deeply etched around his eyes. "Yes, but I'm aging like fine wine." "You, on the other hand, are aging like finer wine." He pulled her into his arms. "You're even more beautiful now than the day I met you. You're ridiculous. I'm honest." He kissed her, slow and sweet. "You're beautiful and I love you, and I thank God every single day that you let me be part of your life." "Let you?" "Yates, you are my life. You and the kids and this ranch. This is everything I ever wanted and more than I dared to dream." They made love that night with the comfortable passion of long marriage. And afterward, Margaret lay in his arms thinking about the journey that had brought them here. From that first day outside the boarding house, when a cowboy had offered to help her file a deed herself, to this moment, lying in bed in a house they had built with their own hands on land that was legally hers. It had been hard, harder than anything she could have imagined. But it had also been beautiful, more beautiful than she ever could have dreamed. In 1910, Margaret turned 49 and Yates turned 51. Their ranch was thriving, run now by a partnership between them and Daniel, who had proven himself an excellent cattleman. Sarah had returned from normal school and was teaching at a school they had helped establish for local children. William was managing their expanded farming operations, growing not just food for their own use, but crops to sell in the growing markets of Montana. "We should write it all down," Sarah said one evening when the whole family was gathered for Sunday dinner. "The story of how you two started this ranch, how Mama filed her claim and fought for her land. It's an important story." "Who would want to read about us?" Margaret asked, embarrassed. "Everyone," Sarah insisted. "Especially women who are trying to do what you did. You showed it was possible." "Your mother showed it was possible," Yates corrected. "I just helped." "You did more than help," Margaret said, taking his hand across the table. "We did it together." They decided to write it down, spending winter evenings recording their memories while Sarah took notes. It became a family project, with each of them contributing their perspectives and memories. And as Margaret told the story of walking into Cornelius Whitmore's office, of being told she could never own land, of meeting a cowboy who offered to help her file the deed herself, she marveled at how that single moment had changed everything. In 1915, Margaret and Yates celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting everyone they had helped over the years. Women who had filed homestead claims came with their families. Cowboys who had worked for them came with stories and gratitude. The ranch was filled with laughter and music and love. 30 years, Margaret said as she danced with Yates in the barn they had cleared out for the celebration. "Can you believe it? Best 30 years of my life, Yates said. And I'm looking forward to 30 more. I don't know if we'll get 30 more, we're getting old. Then however many we get, I'll treasure every single day. He pulled her closer. I love you, Margaret Harper. You've given me a life I never thought I could have. We gave it to each other, Margaret said. That's the secret, I think. We gave it to each other. Daniel and Emily had given them 3 grandchildren by then, with another on the way. Sarah had married a fellow teacher, a gentle man who respected her intelligence and supported her work. William was courting a young woman from Butt, and wedding bells were likely in the near future. Our family is growing, Margaret said to Yates one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Sometimes I look around at all these people, all these children and grandchildren, and I can't believe it all started with a handkerchief full of money and a desperate dream. It started with your courage, Yates said. Everything else grew from that. No, Margaret said firmly. It started with courage and help and love. It started with a partnership. That's what made it all possible. In 1920, Margaret turned 59 and Yates turned 61. They were officially old now, though neither felt it. They still worked the ranch, though they left more and more of the heavy work to their children and the hands they employed. They still had each other, still laughed together, still made love on quiet evenings when the house was empty. I've been thinking, Yates said one morning as they drank coffee on their porch, about legacy. What about it? We've built something remarkable here, not just land and cattle, but a whole community. The women you've helped, the children Sarah has taught, the innovations William has made in farming. This ranch is more than just property. It's a statement that people can build something good if they work together. It's our statement, Margaret said. Yours and mine. Ours, Yates agreed. He reached for her hand. I want to make sure it continues, that when we're gone, this place still stands for those values. They spent the next few years making plans for the future. Legal documents ensuring the ranch would stay in the family, trusts to support Sarah's school, funds to help women file homestead claims, named in Margaret's honor. They wanted to make sure that everything they had built would continue beyond their own lives. In the summer of 1925, Margaret turned 64. The children threw her a birthday celebration that brought people from all over Montana. Women she had helped decades ago came with their grown children. Students Sarah had taught came with their families. Business partners, neighbors, friends, all gathered to celebrate the woman who had shown them what was possible. Look at all these people, Margaret said to Yates as they surveyed the crowd. Look at what we've done. Look at what you've done, Yates corrected gently. You changed their lives. We changed their lives, Margaret insisted. Always we, never just me. That night, after everyone had gone home and the ranch was quiet again, Margaret and Yates lay in their bed, the same bed he had built for her cabin 40 years before. Are you happy? Yates asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. I'm more than happy, Margaret said. I'm fulfilled, I'm grateful, I'm blessed beyond measure. Good, he pulled her closer. Because you deserve all of it. Every bit of happiness, every bit of success, you earned it all. We earned it together, Margaret said, as she always did. You and me together. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms as they had done for 40 years, and Margaret dreamed of the future, of grandchildren running through fields of wildflowers, of great-grandchildren she might live to see, of a legacy that would outlast them both. But mostly, she dreamed of the past, of a young woman standing in front of a cattle baron, being told she could never own land, of a cowboy who offered to help her file the deed herself, of a partnership that had started with hope and grown into love, of a life well lived together. The years continued to be kind to Margaret and Yates. They grew older gracefully, remaining active and engaged with their family and their ranch. In 1928, they celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. "I never imagined this," Margaret said, holding her newest great-grandchild, Daniel's grandson. "Never imagined I'd live to see so much family." "It's all because of you," Yates said, sitting beside her. His hair was completely white now, but his eyes were still that creek water green she had fallen in love with decades before. "All of this family, all of this love, it started with your dream." "It started with our dream," Margaret corrected, as she always did. In 1930, Margaret turned 69 and Yates turned 71. They were slowing down now, spending more time on their beloved porch and less time in the fields. But their minds were sharp, and their love was as strong as ever. "Do you have any regrets?" Yates asked her one evening as they watched the sunset paint their mountains gold. Margaret thought about it carefully. "Only one," she said finally. "I wish my parents could have lived to see what I built. I wish they could have known that their little lark found her song." "They know," Yates said firmly. "Somehow, somewhere they know. What about you? Any regrets?" "Not a single one." Yates took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring, worn thin after 45 years. "Every choice I made led me to you. How could I regret any of it? That winter was hard on both of them. Montana winters were always brutal, but age made them harder to bear. Still, they endured together, keeping each other warm, entertaining each other with stories and memories." Spring came, as it always did, bringing renewal and hope. Margaret planted her garden as she had done every year for almost 50 years. The work was harder now, her back aching, her hands stiff with arthritis. But she persevered because the garden was her meditation, her connection to the earth she had fought so hard to own. Yates worked alongside her, moving slowly but steadily. They didn't speak much anymore while they worked. They didn't need to. 45 years of marriage had taught them to communicate in silence, to understand each other with a glance or a touch. In the summer of 1931, Margaret woke up one morning to find Yates hadn't gotten out of bed. His breathing was shallow, and when she touched his forehead, it was burning with fever. The doctor came from Butt, but there was little he could do. Pneumonia had set in, and at 72, Yates's body simply didn't have the strength to fight it off. For 3 days, Margaret sat by his bedside, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together. Their children came, said their goodbyes. Their grandchildren came, crying as they kissed his weathered cheeks. On the 4th day, as the sun was setting, Yates opened his eyes and looked at Margaret with perfect clarity. "It's been the greatest honor of my life," he whispered, "to love you." "And mine to love you," Margaret said through her tears. "You gave me everything. You showed me what partnership really means. We showed each other." He smiled, the same smile that had won her heart 47 years before. "Don't be sad. We had more happiness than most people dare to dream of. I'm not ready to say goodbye. You don't have to. I'll always be with you, Margaret. In this land we worked together, in the children we raised, in every sunset over these mountains. I'll always be here." He closed his eyes then, his breathing growing slower, softer. Margaret held his hand and whispered her love over and over until, with one last gentle exhalation, Yates Harper left this world. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. The church in Butt couldn't hold everyone, so they held the service at the ranch, beneath the cottonwood trees where they had been married 46 years before. Person after person stood to speak about what Yates had meant to them. His kindness, his integrity, his unwavering support of his wife's dreams. But it was Margaret who spoke last, her voice steady despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Yates Harper helped me file a deed when a cattle baron said I could never own land, she said. But he gave me so much more than that. He gave me partnership instead of ownership. He gave me respect instead of dominion. He gave me love that grew stronger with every passing year. He showed me that true strength isn't in controlling others but in supporting them, in lifting them up, in walking beside them, not ahead of them. She looked around at the assembled crowd. He was my husband, my partner, my best friend, and my greatest love. And every woman here who owns land, who has filed a claim, who has built something of her own, stands on the foundation he helped lay. He proved that men and women can work together as true equals. That's his legacy, and it's one I'll spend the rest of my life honoring. They buried Yates on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains he had loved. Margaret planted a cottonwood tree beside his grave, and beneath his name on the simple headstone, she had them carve. He helped her fly. The months after Yates's death were the hardest of Margaret's life. She had faced so much over the years, but losing her partner, her love, her other half, felt like losing part of herself. There were mornings when she wasn't sure she could get out of bed. Days when the grief was so overwhelming she could barely breathe. But she had children who needed her, grandchildren who looked to her for strength, a ranch that still needed to be run. And she had Yates's voice in her head, reminding her that she had always been strong enough to do hard things. So she got up. She kept going. She continued to help women file homestead claims, because that work had always been important to both of them. She spent time with her family, telling them stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive. And slowly, gradually, the grief became bearable. Not gone, never gone, but integrated into her life like the scars on her work-worn hands. Evidence of pain survived, of battles fought, of a life fully lived. In 1935, Margaret turned 74. She was one of the oldest homesteaders still living, and people came from all over to document her story. Journalists, historians, young women seeking inspiration, they all came to the Harper Ranch to meet the woman who had defied a cattle baron and built an empire. It wasn't an empire, Margaret always corrected. It was a partnership, and I couldn't have done any of it without Yates. But she also told them about the filing process, about the requirements, about how to stand firm in the face of dismissal and doubt. She showed them her original deed, now framed and hanging in her living room. She walked them through her land, pointing out every improvement, every building, every fence post that she and Yates had worked so hard to establish. Land ownership is power, she told a group of young women who came to interview her in 1938. But it's not the only power. The real power is in knowing your own worth, in refusing to accept limitations, in finding people who will partner with you instead of trying to control you. One of the young women raised her hand. Did you ever doubt yourself? Ever think about giving up? Every single day, Margaret admitted. But doubt and action aren't mutually exclusive. You can be terrified and still keep moving forward. That's not courage. That's just choosing to act despite the fear. In the spring of 1939, Margaret celebrated her 78th birthday. Her health was failing now, her body finally succumbing to 8 decades of hard living. But her mind remained sharp, and she insisted on planting her garden one more time. Daniel tried to discourage her. "Mama, let us do it. You need to rest." "I'll have plenty of time to rest soon enough," Margaret said firmly. "This is my last spring, I can feel it. And I want to put seeds in the ground one more time." So they helped her to the garden, and she worked slowly, carefully, placing each seed with loving attention. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the neat rows with satisfaction. "There," she said. "That's a good thing done." She was right about it being her last spring. By summer, she was confined to her bed, her children taking turns sitting with her, making sure she was comfortable and not alone. "I'm ready," she told them. "I've had a good life, a full life, and I'm ready to see Yates again." "Don't talk like that," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "We still need you." "No, you don't. You're all strong and capable. You'll be fine." Margaret smiled at her daughter. "Better than fine, you'll be wonderful. Just remember what your father and I taught you. About partnership, about integrity, about building something that matters." On a warm evening in August, as the sun was setting over the mountains she had loved for 55 years, Margaret Harper passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 78 years old, and she died in the house she had built on the land she had fought to own. They buried her next to Yates, under the cottonwood tree that had grown tall and strong in the years since his death. Her headstone read, "She filed the deed herself." The Harper Ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's leadership, then his children's, then their children's. It became a symbol of what was possible when people worked together, when determination met opportunity, when love and respect formed the foundation of partnership. And in the Montana State Archives, carefully preserved, sits the original homestead claim filed by Margaret Catherine Flynn in 1884. A simple document that changed one woman's life and inspired countless others. The land office clerk who had been so skeptical that first day would have been astounded to see what Margaret built. A ranch that lasted generations. A family that embodied her values. A legacy that proved women could own land, run ranches, and build empires of their own. But Margaret would have insisted, as she always did, that she didn't do it alone. That a cowboy named Yates Harper had helped her when no one else would. That their partnership had been the secret to everything they accomplished, and she would have been right. Because the true story wasn't just about a woman who filed a deed herself. It was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who built a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, who proved that love and equality could exist together. It was a story about a cattle baron who said she'd never own land, and a cowboy who helped her file the deed herself. But more than that, it was a love story. The kind that endured through hardship, that grew stronger with time, that left the world better than it found it. And in the end, isn't that what all the best love stories do?